Hey gang, Voltie here. Today we're going to be doing green sideboard cards, which is going to be the last in the single color sideboard card series. After this we'll do lands and colorless and multicolored in some order. Green is a very interesting spot when it comes to sideboard cards in Highlander. Unlike most of the other colors, green's role is very simply defined. However, it is quite narrow in its ability to impact your sideboard building decisions. For example, white has a bunch of spot removal you can play, as well as some disenchants. Blue has various counter spells and interactive spells with different levels of potency. Black has some spot removal and some wraths, and red, beyond having red elemental blast and pyroblast, does have quite a number of options. Green sideboard options are basically naturalize effects with a couple of different versions and a couple of key anti-blue cards that you'll probably always be playing in your green sideboards. So this video is going to be a fair bit shorter than the other ones, if I'm honest, and the green sideboard card list is shorter than the other ones, but let's get right into it. So to start things off in the 1-drop slot, we have a couple of different pieces of anti-blue. We have Allosaurus Shepherd, which makes your green spells uncounterable, and itself can't be countered. This is a very common Elves card, and whether or not you play it in the main deck or the sideboard kind of depends on your metagame, just because it's a 1-mana 1/1, and if you expect your opponent not to be interacting with you on the stack, then it's a pretty bad body. We have Carpet of Flowers. If you haven't played Highlander much, this card might seem a bit innocuous to you, but Carpet of Flowers is one of the biggest draws to green in Highlander, and it's not particularly close. If you have access to a carpet in your opening hand and it resolves, your blue opponent is just going to be drowned in mana. You can play a lot more spells a lot more quickly. It can be used to accelerate things, it can be used to dump mana into your mana sinks, and it's a real must-answer threat. We then have Veil of Summer. This card has fallen off a bit over recent metagames. Basically, if you're playing a combo deck and you have access to Thoughtseize, you may not want to be playing Veil of Summer, because you can have a look at your opponent's hand and interact with them. The main purpose of Veil of Summer is to protect a combo piece, especially an individual spell, something like Doomsday, for example. But because Veil of Summer can itself be misstepped or countered, you can really find yourself in a spot if your opponent has multiple pieces of interaction, where if you were to Thoughtseize them and take one counter spell and see a second one, you could simply not go for it until you find another piece. So Veil is a bit interesting. Whether or not you play it really depends on what you expect to be getting out of it. If you expect to punk out a spell like a blue elemental blast and resolve something really big like a Minskimbu or a Palantir, then Veil's really good. If you don't have access to blue or black and you want to be able to beat blue and black, Veil's pretty good. We then have Xantid Swarm. This is a OG Storm sideboard card. I think 3 was the maximum that people would play. Basically, it's silence on a stick. If you're playing any kind of combo deck that doesn't rely on creatures, you can expect that your Xantid Swarm will live more often than it doesn't. If your opponent is taking out their Swords to Plowshares and their Fatal Push, your Xantid Swarm can stick. If your opponent doesn't have a flying blocker, you can attack every turn and resolve whatever you're looking to resolve, whether that's, pieces of your combo that need to be on board, or you just want to resolve some draw spells and cantrips. The main reason to not play Xantid Swarm is if you're playing a combo deck that does rely on creatures and still wants to be beating counter magic, because if you expect your opponent to keep removal spells in their deck, then they can still beat your Xantid Swarm. For the rest of the 1-drops, most of them are pretty niche options. A lot of the green sideboard cards that are more powerful are 2-drops. but we'll go quickly through. We have Elephant Grass. This is a pretty old school card. If you can afford to keep the cumulative upkeep cost relatively easily, and you can keep paying for it, it will usually act as a moat or a semi-moat. This is really important if you're looking to make your land drops and cast bigger spells, or if you're trying to buy time to resolve something like Actual Moat or Humility. We have Haywire Might and Insidious Fungus. These are two of the creature disenchant or naturalize effects that you can be playing. Haywire Might is very good because it is colorless to cast, so if you expect to hit green mana a little bit later on, because you're looking to fetch a Tundra first, you can play out your Haywire Might. It's also notable that you can get it off something like Trinket Mage or Urza's Saga. Insidious Fungus can be green sunsed for, and its tertiary mode, when you don't need to be naturalizing something, is a real card. It's also a 1 mana 1/2, so it's a little bit safer and better at blocking. For other disenchants, we have Nature's Claim. If you need to blow up a hate piece, like a Rest in Peace or a Stony Silence or a Null Rod, and your combo doesn't rely on your opponent being on 20 or less, then Nature's Claim is really good. There are a couple of other disenchants and naturalizers that you'll see that are just a bit more impactful, so Nature's Claim has definitely fallen off over the years, but it's still a very potent card, so picking one up for 50 cents is probably a good idea. And then we have Pest Infestation and Pick Your Poison. Pick Your Poison has the upside of being able to destroy a creature with flying. However, it does require that your opponent sacrifice rather than choosing the target. Sometimes this will matter because the artifact that you want to blow up is indestructible, like the One Ring, and its upside. Sometimes it'll be downside because you need to blow up their really big flyer, but they have a cheap flyer protecting it, for example. Pest Infestation is a big haymaker. If you're planning to play a card like Fracturing Gust, where you're looking to blow up a bunch of artifacts and enchantments and get some value out of it, Pest Infestation is probably the pick. Notably, unlike some other effects like this, you can overpay for Pest Infestation, so if you're looking to blow up 2 things but you have access to 7 or 9 mana, you can get some extra pests out of the deal. For other 1-drops, we have 2 graveyard hate pieces. We have Turn the Earth and Noxious Revival. Turn the Earth is decently good if your opponent is planning to reanimate things, and you want to be able to have access to it multiple times. Notably, if you're playing Endurance, you probably don't need something like Turn the Earth. However, Endurance for 0 mana does require a critical mass of green cards, where Turn the Earth is a bit more splashable. Noxious Revival works in a couple of different ways, and most of the time if you see it, it's in the main deck. However, it is a pretty niche sideboard card that does have applications. Because you can target any card in a graveyard, and it's for free, well, it's 2 life, but it's 0 mana, you can beat things like Reanimate effects, but you can also protect your own graveyard. So if your opponent puts a Rest in Peace on the stack, you can Noxious Revival something in your graveyard that you need. So it's a very good card if you're looking to get a regrowth that also has additional upside, where you can target your opponent's cards. Then we have some protection spells. So we have Legolas's Quick Reflexes. This is one of many different Blossoming defense effect types. You play it, it protects your creature. This one has the upside, or multiple upsides. It has Split Second, so your opponent can't have a second removal spell. And if you get to attack with your creature because you're protecting something that's relatively big, like a Tarmogoyf from Assaulted Plowshares, then you can also eat a creature. It's not the best card and it's not very well situated at the moment, however it is worth noting. We then have Shaper's Sanctuary. This card is only really good if you're playing a lot of creatures and you expect them to be targeted by multi-target removal spells. So if your deck is full of X1s and you expect your opponent to be furying all of them, Shaper's Sanctuary can do a really big number on your opponent. It's also just reasonably good to play on turn 1, and then as you play your mana dorks, if they get picked off, you can replace them, make your land drops, and offset the card disadvantage of playing a mana dork. It's okay. It's a niche sideboard card. Sometimes it'll be worth playing, sometimes it won't. The last 1-drop is Sylvan Safekeeper. If you're playing a creature-based combo deck and you need to protect one particular creature, either for a turn or for a turn cycle, Sylvan Safekeeper is really, really powerful. Because you can sacrifice a land to target itself, it is very hard to remove from the board, which also then makes any other creatures you have difficult to remove from the board. As long as you have some semblance of a mana base, in order to throw and protect your creatures, and your combo doesn't require a 3-drop creature into a 4-drop creature, for example, Sylvan Safekeepers are really powerful. Assuming you're playing a creature-based combo deck, you're probably going to be playing creature tutors like Eladamri's Call or Pod or Green Sun Zenith, and so sideboarding in an effect like this doesn't quite have the downside of needing to draw it, because you can go get it. For 2-drops, we have a lot of different cards with different effects. A lot of them, you'll realistically only play 1 or 2 out of these sideboard cards if they have similar effects, but we'll go through them. So we have Collector Roof. This is a Null Rod on a stick. If you're playing 8 points and you don't have access to Null Rod, Oof is good. If you can search your library with something like Green Sun Zenith, Oof might be better than Null Rod, just because being a creature makes it a little bit weaker to removal. However, if you're playing a number of artifacts and you expect your opponent to be bringing in disenchants, then they can't disenchant your Oof. We also have Seal of Primordium. This is a naturalize on an enchantment that you can play and forget about. So if you expect to need to blow up a hate piece and then go for a combo kill on the same turn, being able to spend the mana early is quite powerful. It's not the best card for the job, but it does have some applications, being a naturalize that you can suspend effectively. And then we have Unravel the Aether. There are a couple of effects like this, but basically green struggles to exile artifacts and enchantments. Haywire Might has changed that over time, however, that can't hit creatures. And so if you want to be able to beat something like Welding Jar or Indestructible, Unravel the Aether does have that application. Otherwise, it's pretty niche and I haven't seen it for a long time. Then we have some Graveyard Hate pieces and Pseudo Hate pieces. We have Scavenging Ooze and Keen-Eyed Curator. These are effectively the same card, they just have different applications on your mana base. Scavenging Ooze is very good if you want a reasonably large creature and you have quite a lot of green mana to feed it. Keen-Eyed Curator asks more green mana of you up front, but the exile target card costs colorless instead of green, and that way you can tap your Badlands or your Scrubland and make sure that you can keep your exile effects online. We then have Ground Seal. This isn't a card I've been seeing, and I'm not really sure why. This card acts in 2 different ways. So you can play it as a cantrip that affects the graveyard. There are lots of ways to target cards in graveyards that are beneficial. So there's things like Dread Return, for example, and Reanimate, any of the reanimation effects, and so this stops those. Notably, however, if you care about your graveyard and you don't plan on targeting cards in your graveyard, Ground Seal is a way to protect your cards from things like Deathrat Charmant and Lion's Ash. It's a very particular card, but the fact that it acts in both of those scenarios, with the low cost being able to cantrip itself and making sure that you get something out of it, I'm really surprised this card doesn't see more play. But I figured I'd list it here. We have Gaia's Blessing. If you expect your opponent to mill you out with Brain Freeze, Gaia's Blessing is fine. Otherwise, there isn't really much of a need to play it. There aren't really any applications anymore for ways to mill yourself over time and trigger your Gaia's Blessing like with a Horseman deck. just because if you're milling a whole deck, you should probably be casting a Thassa's Oracle. But I wanted to list it here just in case things changed in the future and there was an application for it. We have Heroic Intervention. This card is fine. If you're limited in your capacity to play sideboard cards because you're mono green or you're green based, this card is really powerful in terms of swinging a game in your favor. If you're in a meta game where people are going to be casting Supreme Verdict, this card is good. However, if they're casting things like Toxic Deluge or Terminus, then this card bricks in those instances. So whether or not you play it depends on your metagame and what your deck is trying to do. But if you have one lying around from Commander, then maybe it's something to think about when building your next sideboard. We have Outland Liberator. This is a bigger version of Haywire Might and Insidious Fungus, as well as some other effects. You can play a Grizzly Bear and you can blow something up. However, if you get to flip it, you can start disenchanting every turn when it attacks, much like Trigon Predator of old. Card's fine. Sometimes it'll be good. It's seeing quite a lot of play, and it has relevant applications. We then have, let's go with Seed Time. This is a very powerful effect that is very, very particular. So Seed Time is a 2-mana instant, but you can only cast it during your own turn, and it's a Time Walk if your opponent casts a blue spell. So they have to cast a blue spell, and it has to be in your turn, and you need 2 spare mana. However, if you meet those conditions, it's actually just Time Walk, and that's a really, really big deal. So if your combo is relatively cheap in order to cast, and you can have some spare mana, you can hold up Veil of Summer, or you can hold up Seed Time. You can get an extra turn. You can use that turn now that your opponent is tapped low because they cast Counterspell, and do something else, which will hopefully be broken and hopefully end the game. It's a little bit of a pet card. I haven't seen it in a very long time, but its effect is very uniquely powerful. To round out the 2-drops, we have Sylvan Library. This is your pretty classic anti-blue card. It also works against any of the black decks and mid-range decks. If you haven't played with Sylvan Library, the general play pattern is that at some point you'll pay 4 life to draw an extra card, and otherwise it'll be a Miri's Guile, and you'll essentially scry 3 in your upkeep. Well, not scry 3, you'll pick the best card out of 3 cards every turn. However, if you have the ability to gain life, or if you're in a matchup where your life total doesn't matter, the fact that Sylvan Library can draw you anywhere from 2 to 5 extra cards is really, really powerful. So if you're looking to put together a combo that ends the game, you can dig really, really deeply for this. We then have Tarmogoyf. I know this is going to be a bit sacrilegious to put in the sideboard cards. However, if your main deck is an aggressive creature deck and you can play Tarmogoyf, you should probably be playing it in the main deck. However, if your main deck is not an aggressive deck and you're playing like a control deck, for example, but you're already playing green for something like Carpet of Flowers, then having access to Tarmogoyf out of your sideboard can really break open boards for you, and it's a really potent threat at pressuring Planeswalkers, at pressuring the Monarchy and the Initiative, just because it's almost always going to be the biggest creature on the field, and because your opponent has likely sided out the bulk of their removal spells, because you're playing relatively creatureless main deck. That's the reason it's listed here. It's not that Tarmogoyf is weak in the main deck and it's suddenly powerful in the sideboard. It's specifically if you're playing very light on creatures in the main deck and you want to have a threat in the sideboard. The bigger upsides of Tarmogoyf as a sideboard threat is that because it's a creature, it's a limited range of interaction, which they might not have post-board, and it also dodges both the red and blue blasts, which is a really big deal. A lot of the sideboard control threats get blasted, and if you're in those colors, you're probably going to see your opponent board in those blasts. Tarmogoyf dodges all of them. Lastly, we have Weather the Storm. Very simple effect, very niche effect. Whether you want this in your sideboard is very debatable. It's probably correct not to be playing it most of the time. However, if you expect your opponent to cast a bolt and a fire blast in the end of your turn and blow you up, Weather the Storm gains you a bunch of life. It doesn't actually do anything else. Unlike any of the other ways to gain life, it has no other text. However, it's completely backbreaking if you actually put it on the stack. So it's something to keep in mind if you're in a metagame where a lot of people are playing Fire Blast and Price of Progress and other burn spells, it might be worth considering. At 3 mana, we start hitting a lot of the classic green sideboard cards, and there are a lot of haymakers in here. To start things off, we have Choke. Choke is one of the best reasons to be in green if you're not playing blue. The fact that it basically always wins the game against a blue deck when you cast it, and the fact that blue decks have to warp their mana bases to play things like Sink into Stupor or Odawara just to have blue sources that aren't chokeable, really shows you the impact of the card. If you're playing an amount of islands that isn't dramatic, and you don't need to be playing blue spells over the course of a game, it's possible to also play Choke in a blue deck if you're playing a lot of other colors primarily. However, if you're in green, and if you're not playing islands, Choke is basically always correct to play in your sideboard. It's just that impactful, it's that good. Blue decks are always going to exist, islands are always going to exist, so you're going to get a lot out of it. Next we have City of Solitude. This is basically Silence Forever. It's, there are a lot of cards that you can play in your sideboard of your combo decks that beat counter spells. City of Solitude can sometimes be something like a defense grid. There's also Veil of Summer, as previously mentioned, and a couple of other things. But City of Solitude has a couple of things going for it, where a lot of the other cards don't. It's an enchantment, which is the hardest permanent type to remove, and it also stops abilities. Something like Defense Grid stops your opponent casting counter spells, but it doesn't stop them doing things like activating Deathrite Shaman to exile something in your graveyard, or activating Boseiju or Odawara. City of Solitude turns all of those off, and so if that's specifically what you're trying to do, then this card is a complete haymaker. You play it, your opponent has to deal with it. If they don't deal with it, you kill them next turn and there's nothing they can do about it. Next up we have Court of Garenbrig. This is a pretty staple sideboard card when I've been building decks, and I think it's grossly underplayed. If you have the ability to ramp this out with a mana dork, and you expect your opponent to be trying to kill all your creatures, the fact that you've introduced the Monarch mechanic can end the game by itself. It also turns your mana dorks into real threats, so if you play this off a mana dork and both of those stick, your mana dork is now a 3/3. If you've kept the Monarch, it's now a 5/5, and suddenly your Llanowar Elves cracks in for 5, you're drawing extra cards every turn, and your opponent has to deal with both the Monarchy and your massive creature and this enchantment that threatens to grow all of your creatures for the rest of the game. The card is a complete backbreaking sideboard card. It's arguably better than a lot of the other options that people regularly play, like Palantir, and I think it really should be seeing more play than it does. I think one of the contributing factors is that green is quite bad right now, and so are mana dorks, but if you decide to sleeve those up, this card is a really, really powerful sideboard card. It presents a duke, and it ends the game really quickly, and it's something to look at. Next we have Endurance. This is one of the premier green sideboard cards. It's very, very common. It has so many applications. It stops things like if you expect your opponent to be casting a Murktide, you can get rid of their graveyard. It beats reanimation spells, it beats Dredge, it beats Thassa's Oracle. It does it all, and if you have the green card count to evoke it, that's really good. If you don't and you have to pay full retail for it most of the time, it's still quite good. So if you don't have an endurance and you plan on playing green, you should probably pick one up and probably be playing it. There are a lot of naturalizers, so I'm going to stick all of them together, but the last two green cards that are more value-based are Tireless Tracker. If you're playing lands and you don't have a very creature-focused game plan game one, you expect your opponent to be taking out their plow. Tireless Tracker is really, really good. There's a reason it was a staple sideboard card in Legacy lands for years. If you can stick your Tireless Tracker for 1 to 2 turn cycles and you play it with a fetch land on the turn that you play it, it is an incredible amount of value. Suddenly you have this card that's drawing you extra cards every turn, and if you crack those clues, your opponent now has to deal with a 4-3 or a 5-4, and it's challenging the board as well. There's also Pulse of Marasa. This is a pretty cute addition, if I'm honest. However, it does do a lot for what it asks of you. Because it's an instant, you can hold up counter magic, where a lot of the other regrowth effects are sorceries. It does only target creatures and lands, which is a downside. Not being able to pick up a counter spell with your regrowth or, an artifact or enchantment is a downside. However, it does gain 6 life, which is a lot of life for a 3-drop spell that also does something else. I don't know how often you should be playing Pulse of Marasa, but it's 3 cents, and there's going to be some sideboards where it's just correct. The rest of the 3-drops all naturalize. So we have Crows and Grip. It has Split Second, and it destroys an artifact or enchantment. The reason to play Crows and Grip is that it's uncounterable, and you also can't activate abilities, which does come up. For the most part, this card has been replaced and power crept by Boseiju, who endures, just because it has a very similar text spread to Crows and Grip. But if you're already playing Boseiju and you want a second effect and you want it to be instant speed and you want it to be uncounterable, that's what Crows and Grip is for. Manglehorn doesn't naturalize, it only shatters, it only destroys artifacts. However, your opponent's artifacts enter the battlefield tapped, so if your opponent's playing like Academy Wheels, this card might have a bit of extra text. We have Rampaging Yao Guai. If you Green Suns into this, X is 0, which means you can still blow up any amount of artifacts with a total mana value of 0. This can include artifact lands, Moxen, Baubles, 0 mana artifact creatures like Ornithopter and Memnite. If you draw it and you decide to pay X mana, you can actually blow up some things on top of the 0-drops. This is basically the green Gorilla Shaman, which I talked about in the red sideboard card video. If your opponent is playing a lot of artifacts, and a lot of them are artifact lands and 0-drops, this card will blow all of them up and give you a reasonable creature at the end. We then have Rexage, 3 mana 2/1 ETB, destroy an artifact or enchantment. Pretty much as simple as it gets. If you care about playing Rexage, it's probably because of the elf tag. So keep in mind that there are a lot of other disenchant and naturalizers that have been printed over the years, and Rexage is a bit more narrow in what it can do, just because 3 mana is so expensive. However, if you care about the elf tag and you care about destroying artifacts and enchantments and you want to have a spare body at the end of it to use with Heritage Druid or Skull Clamp, then Rexage is fine. We have Tranquil Throwback. This is basically a modal creature. Its base stats are a 3/3/3, and if you pay extra green, you can naturalize something, you can exile a graveyard, and you can gain full life. Card is fine if you're playing some kind of mid-range deck and you want a really flexible sideboard slot. It gets the job done. For the most part, you're spending 4 mana and choosing one mode. However, the fact that you can go over the top and spend all the way up to 6 mana and get every mode is a neat part of the card. Lastly, for 3s, we have Seeds of Innocence. It buries all artifacts. Bury means they can't be regenerated, which is very particularly useful against Welding Jar. But otherwise, this card is a 3 mana Shatterstorm. There are a lot of different 4-mana Shatterstorms that blow up all artifacts, but Seeds of Innocence is the one that does it for 3 mana, and as long as you don't care too much about your opponent gaining quite a lot of life at once, Seeds is really good. For 4s, we have a couple of 4s that aren't really 4s, but we'll go through them. We have Force of Vigor. This is a pitch spell where you can exile a green card from your hand, but you have to be casting it in your opponent's turn, and destroys 2 artifacts or enchantments. Pretty common play pattern is casting it on your opponent's turn 1 and blowing up an Urza Saga and some kind of artifact or enchantment that they've cast off it. The fact that it's an instant speed is less relevant because you're probably not casting it in your own turn, because then you'd have to be paying full retail. So there isn't quite as much flexibility with the card as you might think, and you do have to have a green card count for Force of Vigor, and if you're in green you probably have ways to interact with naturalizers as well, or with artifacts and enchantments, but it's very, very powerful, and whether or not you can squeeze it into your sideboard depends on your green card count for the most part. We have Foundation Breaker. This is another naturalize on a stick. There isn't much reason to play Foundation Breaker off over any of the others. If you evoke it, you're essentially casting a sorcery speed naturalize, and if you spend 4 mana, you can get a 2/2 on top, which isn't great. It does have minor upside. The fact that it goes to the graveyard means that you can reanimate it, and it's a much easier way to get a second copy of it, because if you reanimate something like Insidious Fungus, suddenly you're spending 4 mana on top of your initial effects to blow up 2 things. However, for the most part, the card is really medium. I just wanted to list it here because it is different enough from the others that it's something to think about. We have Reverent Silence. This is a free spell. You can give your opponent 6 life as long as you control a forest, and it's free, and it destroys all enchantments. The fact that it doesn't hit artifacts as well is really bad, and it's a big mark against this card. However, if you're in a metagame where people are playing a lot of white cards and a lot of white enchantments that you care about, so Rest in Peace, Stony Silence, for example, Reverent Silence as a, back to nature variant, being free is a really big deal, and as long as you know that the hate pieces that your opponents are going to be playing are enchantments, so Leyline of the Void, Rest in Peace, Stony Silence, Deafening Silence, High Noon, then Reverent Silence is hopefully as close to a catch-all as possible. We have Obstinate Baloth. This card has fell off a lot. However, if you want to play a big idiot, then that gains you life, and you expect your opponent to be sometimes casting Liliana of the Veil, or Hymn to Turak, or Mind Twist. This card is okay. I wouldn't be playing it very often. However, if your weekly metagame is filled to the brim with black decks that are quite aggressive, maybe Old Bailiff is good enough. We have Questing Beast. This card usually shows up in main decks if people are playing it. However, I did want to list it in the sideboard. If you're playing 4-drops in your main deck that are pointed or more powerful, the most common example is probably Undermountain Adventurer. If you don't want to introduce the Monarchy, or you don't want to introduce the Initiative, but you still want to be able to blow people up with your 4-drop, Questing Beast is really good. The fact that it has haste is a big deal, because green very rarely gets access to haste. And, despite it having quite a lot of text, for the most part, it's a 4-mana 4/4 with haste. Sometimes each of the lines of text will be relevant. So if your opponent is planning on chump blocking, Questing Beast's second line goes through that. If your opponent is planning on putting a ring on the stack, Questing Beast goes through that. If your opponent is going to be playing a Planeswalker on an empty board, then Questing Beast goes through that. The fact that it has Vigilance and Death Touch do matter, but the fact that it's a 4-mana 4/4 with haste is by far the most important, and if you're in the market for that, you can't really do better than Questing Beast. I'm going to skip Thrun briefly. We'll talk about Tsunami. So for 4 mana at sorcery speed, it destroys all islands. If you expect your opponent to be bringing in disenchants and blowing up your choke, and you have ways to protect your spells, Tsunami is a bit more impactful than choke in that regard. If your opponent is playing islands and leaving them untapped and threatening to counter one of your big spells, choke isn't going to help you with that. However, choke is 1 mana cheaper and will usually get the job done, so you probably don't need to be putting Tsunami into your sideboard. The main reason I've listed it here is that if you have a carpet and a choke in your sideboard and you're really, really weak to blue decks, and you have, if you're not in red and you can't play the 2 red blasts, maybe Tsunami is good enough. It's incredibly high impact, obviously, when you actually get to resolve it. So it's something to put in your box for 50 cents and just have ready to go. The last sideboard cards are just varying different kinds of threats that you can put in your green decks that have mana dorks as top end. All of these are similar in power level, and they're all a little bit weaker than you would probably expect. If you play Thrun, it can't be countered, and it has Regenerate to beat things like Supreme Verdict, but it can't beat Wrath of God. It has Hexproof as well. Notably, it doesn't have any combat keywords, so if your opponent just plays a Sheoldred or a Gurmag Angler, this isn't going to cut it. But it's the OG. I really like the card, and whether or not it's good enough for your sideboard kind of depends on how weak you are to those blue decks. We have Thragtusk. If you play things like Ephemerate, or Restoration Angel, or Flicker effects, or if you really care about gaining 5 life and blocking twice, Thragtusk is really good. That's its base. That's basically its only application. Otherwise, you're better off playing a different threat. If you expect your opponent not to be playing removal spells, you can play something like Elder Gargaroth, but for the most part, you should be keeping your sideboard a lot leaner. Whether you play a 4 or a 5 drop in your sideboard really depends on how much mana you expect to be making and how bad some of your main board threats pair up into your opponent. We have Thrun, Breaker of Silence. It also can't be countered. It has Hexproof, but only for non-green cards. For the most part, this reads as Hexproof. There are very few green spells that can target a Thrun that actually matter. And if it's your turn, it has Indestructible, so it's similar to the Regenerate text in terms of combat. However, it's a little bit worse at blocking, but it's a lot better at attacking. And then it has Trample, so the fact that it has a combat keyword is a big deal. And so I think Breaker of Silence is probably just better than the last Troll, 90% of the time. We then have Ayev, Progenitor Ooze. I'll be honest, I put this on the sideboard cards list because I don't know if there is a deck that wants to be playing this in its sideboard. If you expect to be playing a lot of spells in one turn and you want something to go over the top, this card ends the game really, really quickly. Because if you make 3 oozes, they're all 4/4s, which is a huge deal. And if you make 4, then it's actually just 20 damage. I'm not certain what deck wants to play Ayev, however, it's a very cheap card at 30 cents or so, and if there's ever a time that you want to play an effect like Ayev, I'm pretty sure it's just going to be the best one. As I mentioned, green is a little bit light in terms of what its sideboard cards actually do. For the most part, it's just a series of naturalizers and anti-blue cards. Doesn't really have any good anti-mid-range cards, and it doesn't really have any particularly devastating hate cards. If you're looking to blow up graveyards, you have Endurance, and that's about it. Everything else is a little bit weaker than something like a Rest in Peace or a Leyline of the Void. But otherwise, there are definitely powerful green sideboard cards, and you should keep them in mind when you're building your sideboard because, while the other colors have a few more standouts than green does, some of the green sideboard cards like Carpet and Choke are really best in class. Yeah, that's going to be it for the green sideboard cards. As always, a link to the collection is going to be in the description below, and the next one I'll do will probably be colorless, so keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, this video was brought to you with the help and support of my lovely patrons, who you can see up here. If you want to support the channel, you can join the Patreon. There'll be a link to that below. There's also going to be a link tree so that you can find any of the other ways. If you visit my website, so voltie.online, there's also a couple of different links there as well, just in case you want to be able to catch that. And if you see this video on the website, you can check those links out below. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're not subscribed, I would ask that you please consider it at the very least. It's free, it doesn't cost you anything, and it really does help grow the channel. But otherwise, that's it from me for today, and I'll catch you all next time.